I've spent enough years watching people to know this much. The ones who stay aren't always the ones who promise to. Promises are easy. Staying is hard. And sometimes the person who shows up with nothing, no beauty, no fortune, no sweet words, turns out to be the one who was always meant to be there. I saw it happen once, up in the mountains, where a man had stopped believing anyone would remain. The stagecoach driver didn't help her down. He sat there, reins slack, watching her struggle with the leather valise like she was already a ghost. Martha Brennan landed hard on the packed dirt, dust blooming around her worn boots. Cedar Hollow. 3 buildings. A water trough. Nothing else. "You sure about this?" he asked. Didn't wait for an answer. The whip cracked. Wheels groaned. Gone. She stood alone in the afternoon light, squinting at the mountain rising ahead. The general store woman appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, mouth pressed thin. Silas Kane's 4th bride. Not a question. More like a verdict. Martha said nothing. She lifted her valise. She started walking toward the trail that disappeared into the pines. Somewhere up there, a man was waiting. Or not waiting at all. The boy quit halfway up the mountain. "Ain't going no further?" He stuffed Martha's coin into his pocket, already backing down the trail. "Man up there's crazy? Talks to himself. Shoots at shadows." Martha watched him scramble over the rocks, bare feet slapping against stone, until he disappeared around the bend. The valise handle cut into her palm. She shifted her grip and kept climbing. The path narrowed. Roots snaked across packed earth, gnarled fingers reaching for her ankles. She stumbled twice, caught herself on rough bark. Pine sap sticky against her skin. Sweat crawled down her spine, soaking through the calico dress until it clung to her back like a second skin. Her corset pressed against ribs that ached with each breath. An hour passed. Maybe longer. The trees began to thin. The cabin sat in a clearing like something the world had forgotten. Gray timber darkened by years of weather, gaps in the chinking where the wind would whistle through, a roof that sagged on one end, shingles curling upward like dead leaves. No smoke rose from the chimney. No horse stood in the lean-to stable. The only sound was wind through dead grass and the distant complaint of a crow. Martha set down her valise, flexed her fingers. Red grooves crossed her palm where the handle had bitten in. The door hung slightly open. She climbed the 2 steps to the porch. The boards groaned beneath her weight. She pushed the door wider with her fingertips. Darkness inside. The smell hit her first cold ash, old grease, unwashed wool, and something sharper underneath. Whiskey. Maybe. Her eyes adjusted slowly. A table with 1 chair. A cook stove with rust climbing its legs like ivy. A bedroll in the corner. Blankets twisted and gray. A rifle mounted on the wall. Dust thick enough on the barrel that she could see it even in the dim light. Empty. She stepped inside. The floorboards protested. A tin cup sat on the table. Brown residue dried at the bottom. Beside it, a plate with something that might have been beans, now crusted over and growing fur at the edges. "You're early?" Martha spun around. He filled the doorway. Blocked what little light remained. Taller than she'd expected from the letters. Shoulders too wide for the frame. His face half hidden by a beard gone wild. Hair that hadn't seen scissors in months. Clothes hanging loose. Shirt untucked. Suspenders dangling at his hips. But his eyes, she could see them even in shadow. Not crazy, not mean. Tired. The kind of tired that lived in the bones and never left. "Mr. Kane?" Her voice came out steadier than her hands felt. He didn't move. Didn't offer his hand or step aside. Just stood there, looking at her the way a man looks at rain clouds when he's stopped believing in water. "They usually cry by now," he said. Martha held his gaze. Her throat was dry, tongue thick with trail dust, but she kept her eyes on his. "I don't cry easy. Mr. Kane." He stood there another moment. Then he stepped past her into the cabin, close enough that she caught the full smell of him. Wood smoke and sweat and earth, baked into skin that hadn't seen soap in weeks. He crossed to the cook stove, lifted the cold kettle, shook it. Empty. Set it down with a clang that echoed off the bare walls. "Water's from the creek, 100 yards east." He jerked his chin toward a wooden bucket by the door. "Stove needs kindling. Wood piles out back." Not a welcome. An assignment. Martha picked up the bucket. The handle was rough with splinters, waiting to bite. She walked out into the fading afternoon light without a word. The creek ran shallow over smooth stones, water so clear she could count every pebble on the bottom. She knelt on the bank, filled the bucket, felt the cold bite into her knuckles and climb up her wrists. Her reflection rippled on the surface, face too round, hair escaping its pins in dark tangles, dress stained with sweat under the arms. She carried the water back. Some sloshed over the rim, soaking her boots. Didn't matter. They were already ruined from the walk-up. Inside, Silas had moved to the table. He sat in the single chair now, watching her with those tired eyes as she set the bucket by the stove. She found the wood pile where he'd said, carried in armfuls of split pine until her forearms burned and bark dust coated her sleeves. The kindling caught on the third match. Smoke curled up the chimney pipe. Thin and hesitant at first, then steadier. She filled the kettle, set it on the heat, and only then noticed her hands were shaking. Not from cold, not from the work. 3 weeks on a stagecoach, 400 miles from Ohio. Everything she owned fit in that valise by the door. And this man, this stranger who had paid for her passage, sat there looking at her like she was something ordered from a catalog and found wanting upon arrival. The others, Martha kept her back to him, watching steam begin to rise from the kettle spout. Why'd they leave? Silence stretched behind her. She turned. Silas was staring at the table, one finger tracing a groove worn into the wood by years of use. The lamplight from the single window caught the gray threading through his beard, the hollows carved beneath his eyes. Different reasons. That's not an answer. His jaw tightened. She saw the muscle jump beneath the weathered skin. First one couldn't stand the quiet, said the mountain was trying to swallow her whole. Second one wanted town life dances, church socials, neighbors close enough to borrow sugar from. He stopped. His hand flattened against the table, pressing down hard. Third one found the grave. The kettle began to whisper. Steam curled into the cooling air. Martha's voice came out barely above the hiss of boiling water. Whose grave? Whose... He didn't answer. The kettle screamed. Martha grabbed a rag from the stove handle, lifted the kettle from the heat, set it on the cold side of the iron top. Her hands moved without thought muscle memory from years of working her mother's kitchen back in Ohio. Find the tin of coffee grounds on the shelf. Measure by feel. Pour the water. Stir with a wooden spoon worn smooth by use. Behind her, the chair scraped against the floor. She heard his boots cross the room. The door opened. letting in a rush of cool mountain air. Closed again. Gone. Martha stood alone in the cabin, steam rising from the pot, the question still hanging in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. She poured coffee into the tin cup on the table. The brown residue from before mixed with the fresh brew. She didn't care, Teresa. She drank it standing, her back against the warm stove, her eyes moving across the room. One plate, one cup, one chair. A man who had stopped expecting company. The valise sat where she'd left it by the door. She crossed to it, knelt on the rough floorboards, undid the brass latches that her mother had polished every Sunday for 15 years. Inside 2 dresses, both mended at the seams more than once. A hairbrush with a cracked handle. A Bible her mother had pressed into her hands at the station in Cincinnati, spine soft from decades of reading. And at the bottom, wrapped in muslin cloth, the starter dough she'd kept alive for 6 years, running. She lifted it out carefully, still warm from her body heat during the journey, still breathing, in its way the yeast working even now, patient and persistent. The cabin had a small window, the glass wavy with age. Through it, she could see the clearing, the dark line of trees, the last light of day bleeding orange and pink across the sky. And Silas. He stood at the edge of the pines, his back to the cabin, shoulders hunched forward like a man bracing against wind that wasn't blowing. She watched him for a long moment. Then she turned and found the broom. The floor hadn't been swept in weeks, maybe longer. Dust and dirt and dried mud from boots that tracked in and out without care. She worked from the corners inward, methodical, the bristles scratching against warped boards. Cobwebs came down from the rafters in gray strings. She shook out the bedroll near the door, coughing at the cloud that billowed up, thick with the smell of unwashed wool and old sweat. By the time full darkness pressed against the window, the cabin looked different. Not clean, that would take more than one evening, but tended, cared for, like someone had noticed it existed. The door creaked open. Silas stood in the frame, a lantern in his hand, the flame throwing wild shadows across his face. He looked at the swept floor, the straightened bedroll, the coffee pot still warm on the stove. His eyes moved across each detail, slow and careful, like a man reading words in a language he'd forgotten. Then his gaze found hers. "You're still here?" Martha hung the broom on its nail by the door. "Where else would I go?" Something shifted in his expression too quick to name, gone before she could catch it. He stepped inside, set the lantern on the table, reached into his coat, pulled out a wool blanket, gray and rough, and laid it across the second bedroll she hadn't noticed before, pushed into the corner farthest from his own. "That's yours. I sleep in the stable with the horse." He was halfway out the door when she spoke. "Mr. Kane." He stopped. His hand gripped the door frame. He didn't turn around. "I asked you a question earlier about the grave." The lantern flame guttered in the draft from the open door. His knuckles went white against the dark wood, tendons standing out beneath the weathered skin. "My wife?" The words came out like stones dragged up from deep water. "And the child she was carrying when she died?" The door closed behind him. Martha stood in the silence, the rough wool blanket in her hands, the coffee growing cold on the stove, the weight of what he'd said settling into the cabin walls like something that had always been there, waiting for someone to finally hear it spoken aloud. Outside. The stable door creaked open, then shut. She looked at the blanket, at the single chair, at the rifle mounted on the wall, untouched, gathering years of dust. 3 brides before her, all gone within days of arriving. She set the blanket down on her bedroll, crossed to her valise, pulled out the muslin-wrapped starter dough and set it on the table beside the cold cup of coffee. Tomorrow she would need to find flour, salt, a proper bowl for mixing. Tomorrow she would make bread. But tonight she lay on the thin bedroll Silas had given her, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the wind move through the pines outside and the distant, restless sound of a man pacing the stable floor back and forth, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the gaps in the cabin walls. When she finally closed her eyes, one question came unbidden, sharp as a blade against her tired mind. What kind of woman could leave a man alone with that much grief? And what kind of woman would choose to stay? Day 9. Martha woke before dawn, the way she had every morning since arriving. The cabin held the smell of yesterday's bread, her 3rd successful loaf from the starter dough she'd carried all the way from Ohio. She lay still on the bedroll, listening. Wind in the pines, a bird calling somewhere distant. And beneath it all, the familiar absence of footsteps from the stable. She rose, dressed in the gray light filtering through the gaps in the walls, and pushed open the cabin door. Silas stood at the woodpile, axe raised mid-swing. He wasn't looking at the wood. He was staring past her, toward the cabin. She turned, followed his gaze. The window she'd scrubbed clean 3 days ago caught the first pink of sunrise, glass gleaming where it had been dull with years of grime. The curtain she'd sewn from flour sacks hung straight and white against the frame. Thin smoke curled from the chimney, steady and even, proof that someone had tended the fire with care. When she looked back, he was swinging again. The blade bit deep into pine. Crack. Split. He kicked the pieces aside and reached for another log. Martha walked down to the creek. The bucket handle had worn grooves into her palms over these 9 days, calluses forming where blisters had risen and broken. She knelt on the bank, filled the bucket, felt the familiar cold bite into her knuckles. The water ran clear and fast over smooth stones, carrying the smell of mountain snow even in late spring. She carried it back without spilling a drop. This was their rhythm now. Words weren't required. She cooked. He brought wood inside before she asked. She cleaned. He disappeared into the tree line for hours and returned with rabbits or wild onions, or sometimes nothing at all except mud on his boots and pine needles caught in his beard. They ate at the table together, 2 chairs now, though she hadn't seen him build the second. It had simply appeared on the 5th morning, rough-hewn and slightly uneven, placed across from his own. She set the bucket inside and checked the starter dough, bubbling gently in its crock. Alive. Ready. The smell of yeast and warm flour filled the small cabin, mixing with wood smoke and coffee grounds. Outside, the axe stopped. Martha moved to the window, pushed aside the flour sack curtain. Silas stood motionless at the woodpile, one hand shading his eyes against the climbing sun and staring toward the eastern ridge. She stepped out onto the porch. A figure moved through the distant trees, man-shaped, leading a mule down the trail. Silas set down the axe slowly. He walked toward the tree line, his stride changing as he moved, shoulders pulling back, chin lifting. The posture of a man preparing himself for something unwelcome. The figure emerged into the clearing. Older than Silas by 20 years at least. White beard stained yellow at the corners of his mouth. a battered hat that might have been brown once, now sun-bleached to the color of dust. He raised one gnarled hand in greeting, the other holding the mule's lead rope. "Silas Kane," the old man's voice carried across the meadow. Rough as gravel scraped across a dry creek bed. "Heard you got yourself another bride sent up from back east." Silas said nothing. He stopped 10 feet from the old man, arms hanging loose at his sides. The visitor's eyes found Martha on the porch. He studied her the way a man studies a horse at auction, measuring, calculating, noting every flaw. "This one's different," he said finally. "Murphy." Silas's voice came out flat, stripped of anything that might be called welcome. "What do you want?" Murphy tied the mule to a fence post that leaned at a crooked angle. He reached into his saddlebag, rummaged around, pulled out a brown glass bottle, held it up to catch the light. "Brought whiskey. Thought we might have ourselves a talk." His eyes cut back to Martha, sharp despite the weathered face, private-like. Silas glanced over his shoulder at the cabin. At her. Something passed across his features, not quite a warning, not quite an apology. Something in between. "Go on inside," he said. "This won't take long." Martha didn't move. Her hands found the porch rail, fingers wrapping around the rough wood. Murphy let out a dry laugh, a sound like dead leaves scraping against stone. "Got some spine on this one. Might last longer than 8 days after all. What do you want, Murphy?" The old man's smile disappeared. He tucked the whiskey bottle under his arm and reached back into his coat with his free hand. His fingers emerged holding a folded piece of paper yellowed at the edges, creased from years of handling, soft with age. "Granger's boy is back in town." Murphy held out the paper, arm extended. "Got himself a fancy lawyer, all the way from Denver. Been asking questions around Cedar Hollow, about your land, about how you came to own it." Silas took the paper, unfolded it with hands that didn't quite stay steady. His jaw tightened as his eyes moved across the words, the muscle jumping beneath the skin of his cheek. "That land sale was legal, signed and witnessed." "Legal and provable ain't always the same thing, Silas." Murphy's gaze slid toward Martha again, then back to Silas. "You still got the original receipt? The one with Old Man Granger's signature on it?" The silence stretched out across the clearing like a held breath. Martha watched Silas's hands. They were steady on the paper now, but his knuckles had gone white where he gripped the edges. "I'll find it," he said. Murphy nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He untied his mule, swung up into the saddle with a grunt that spoke of old bones and stiff joints. "You got maybe a week, way I figure it. Granger's been talking to the sheriff, saying you stole his birthright, saying his daddy never would have sold, not for any price." He gathered the reins, turned the mule back toward the trail. Then he paused, tipped his hat in Martha's direction. "Ma'am." The mule picked its way back into the trees. Murphy didn't look back. Silas stood in the clearing, the crumpled paper in his fist, staring at the ground where the old man had stood. The morning light fell across his face, catching every line carved there by years and weather and grief. Martha came down from the porch. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the vein pulsing at his temple, the rapid rise and fall of his chest beneath his worn shirt. "What does that paper say?" He didn't answer. "Mr. Kane?" She made her voice steady, firm. "What does it say?" He looked up finally, met her eyes. And for the first time since she'd arrived on that stagecoach 9 days ago, she saw something besides exhaustion in his face. She saw fear. It says I have 30 days to prove I own this land. His fingers crushed the paper tighter, knuckles straining white. Or they take everything. The cabin, the stable, the creek, all of it. He stopped. His throat moved as he swallowed. Martha understood what he couldn't say. They would take the ground where his wife and child lay buried. She reached out before she could think better of it. Her fingers brushed his wrist, just above the crumpled paper, feeling the heat of his skin and the tension running through him like wire pulled too tight. "Where's the receipt?" His voice came out hollow, emptied of everything. "I don't know." She found him at the creek 3 days later. The morning had started wrong. Martha woke to an empty clearing, no steady rhythm of the axe, no thin trail of smoke rising from the stable, where Silas sometimes built a small fire to warm his hands before the day's work. She checked the woodpile, the chicken coop, the lean-to where he kept his tools lined up on pegs he'd carved himself. Nothing. No sign of him anywhere. Then she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the mountain. Low and rhythmic, almost like choking, almost like something dying. She followed it down the eastern slope, through the thick stand of pines where the morning light barely reached the forest floor, past the mossy boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, around the bend where the creek curved sharp against a wall of granite. And there he was, Silas Kane, on his knees in the shallows, water soaking through his trousers, turning the worn fabric dark as old blood. His shoulders shook with each breath. His hands gripped the stones beneath the surface, knuckles white, tendons straining like ropes pulled past their limit. He was weeping. Martha stopped at the tree line. Her boot cracked a dry branch. The sound echoed off the rocks like a gunshot. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. Just stayed there in the cold water, bent over himself, making that terrible sound. She could leave, walk back to the cabin, pretend she hadn't seen. That's what the others would have done, the 3 who came before her, the ones who lasted days instead of weeks. That's what he expected. She could read it in the rigid line of his spine, the way he held himself like a man waiting for a blow that wouldn't come. Instead, she walked forward. The cold water hit her boots first, seeping through the worn leather, numbing her toes within seconds. She didn't stop, kept moving until she stood beside him, close enough to see the tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face, close enough to smell the creek water mixing with his sweat. "I looked everywhere." His voice came out raw, scraped hollow by something deeper than grief. Every drawer, every tin box, behind the stove, under the floorboards. I pulled up boards I nailed down myself years ago. His hands released the stones, came up dripping, empty, trembling. "It's gone. The receipt is gone and I can't remember where I put it. And now they're going to take everything and I can't." He stopped, drew a breath that shuddered through his whole body. Martha lowered herself onto the nearest boulder. The cold granite bit through her dress, but she ignored it. Her eyes stayed on his face. "When did you last see it?" He shook his head. Water dripped from his beard onto the surface of the creek, sending ripples out in tiny circles. "Mr. Kane, when before?" The word came out cracked down the middle. "Before she died, I showed it to her. Told her the land was ours, free and clear, legal as Sunday morning. Told her our children would inherit it someday. Our grandchildren." A sound escaped him, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Something between the two, ugly and broken. "I put it back in the tin box under the bed. I remember exactly. I can still see my own hands closing the lid." Martha's mind worked through the pieces. 3 years since his wife died. 3 brides who'd come and gone since then. Any one of them could have moved things, thrown things away, taken things with them when they left. The women before me, did any of them? No. Sharp, certain. His head came up, eyes finding hers for the first time since she'd arrived at the creek. I checked after each one left. Every time. It was always there. Until now. The words hung unspoken between them. She looked at him, this man who had built walls so high he'd almost disappeared behind them, who had stopped believing anyone would stay, who was now drowning in 3 feet of water with his clothes soaked through and his hands shaking, and nothing left to hold on to. Martha stood up. Water streamed from her boots onto the creek bank. Get up. He didn't move. Mr. Kane, get up. His head lifted. Red-rimmed eyes found hers. Confusion there. And something else beneath it. Something that looked almost like the first flicker of a match struck in a dark room. We're going to search again. Together this time. Every inch of that cabin. Every crack in every board. Every gap in every wall. She held out her hand toward him. But not from your knees. Not like this. He stared at her hand, the fingers rough from work, the palm creased with calluses that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. The sleeve of her dress wet to the elbow from wading through the creek to reach him. Then he took it. His grip was cold from the creek water. Strong despite everything. She pulled, and he rose, water streaming from his clothes, and for a moment they stood there in the shallows together, her hand still in his, neither of them moving to break apart. She let go first. Come on. They walked up the slope together, side by side, not touching now, but closer than they'd been before. The cabin waited in the clearing, morning sun warming its gray boards. Martha pushed open the door and looked at the small space with fresh eyes. Somewhere in here was a piece of paper that meant everything. A signature from a dead man that could save the grave of a dead woman and child. Start with the walls, she said. Check for loose boards, hidden spaces, anywhere you might have put something and forgotten. Silas moved to the far corner, knelt down, began pressing his palms against the floorboards, listening for hollow sounds beneath. Martha turned to the stove, gripped its iron legs and pulled, dragging it away from the wall with a scrape that set her teeth on edge. Dust rained down. Ash scattered across the floor she'd swept clean just yesterday. Behind the stove, nothing but mouse droppings and a rusted nail. She kept looking. The morning stretched into afternoon. They worked without speaking. Systematic. Thorough. Every drawer emptied and examined. Every tin opened and searched. Every gap in the walls probed with careful fingers. Martha found things. A woman's hairpin. Tarnished green with age. A child's wooden rattle. Worn smooth by small hands that would never hold it again. A letter from someone named Ruth, dated 1862. The ink faded to brown, but no receipt. The light through the window turned golden, then orange, then began to fade toward gray. Silas sat on the floor, his back against the wall, staring at nothing. Around him lay the gutted contents of his home. Clothes, tools, papers, memories scattered like leaves after a storm. Martha's hands were black with dust. Her back ached from bending. Her knees throbbed from hours of kneeling on hard wood, but she wasn't done. Her eyes moved to the bed. The frame was rough-hewn pine, built solid and low to the ground. She'd searched the mattress already. The space beneath. The small gap between frame and wall where dust collected in thick gray drifts. But she hadn't searched the frame itself. She crossed the room, knelt at the head of the bed, ran her fingers along the joint where the headboard met the side rail. Smooth, solid, no gaps. She moved lower, feeling along the underside of the rail where the wood was rougher, unfinished by any carpenter's hand. Her finger caught on something. A seam, small, hidden by shadow and the angle of the wood. She pressed harder. The seam widened. A thin piece of board shifted under her touch, a false panel, no bigger than her hand, set into the rail with a craft so careful she'd missed it completely. "Mr. Kane." He looked up from across the room. His face was gray with exhaustion. Martha reached into the hidden space. Her fingers touched paper. Dry, folded, old. She pulled it out. The document was yellowed with age, its edges soft from years of handling. But the writing was clear black ink faded to brown, but still legible. And the signature at the bottom, sprawled across the page in a hand that trembled with age. "Or drink or both, Ezekiel Granger. November 14th, 1868. She looked at Silas. He hadn't moved, hadn't breathed. "I found it." He was across the room before she finished speaking. His hands shook as he took the paper from her. His eyes moved across the words, the description of the land, the terms of sale, the amount paid, the signature that proved everything. His voice broke. He tried again. "How did you know to look there?" Martha sat back on her heels. Her fingers were trembling now too. She realized. Her heart pounded against her ribs. "I didn't." She looked at the hidden panel, at the clever way it had been fitted into the frame. Invisible unless you knew exactly where to search. Someone built that space on purpose. Someone who wanted to hide something valuable and keep it safe. Silas stared at the paper, then at the bed frame, then at her. "She built it," he whispered. "My wife, Sarah. She was always making things like this. Secret compartments, hidden drawers, little treasures tucked away for me to find." His voice caught. "I forgot. After she died, I forgot everything she—" He stopped. Couldn't finish. Martha rose to her feet. Her legs were stiff. Her whole body ached. But when she looked at Silas, at this man, holding a piece of paper his dead wife had hidden for him, standing in a cabin scattered with the evidence of their desperate search, she saw something shift behind his eyes. The walls weren't gone, but there was a door in them now, a door she had helped him find. She moved toward the stove, toward the cold coffee and the bread dough that needed kneading and the 100 small tasks that kept a home alive. Behind her, she heard him fold the paper carefully, heard him cross to the table, heard the scrape of the chair as he sat down, and then, so quiet, she almost missed it. "Martha." She stopped, turned. He was looking at her. Really looking. For the first time since she'd arrived, not through her, not past her, but at her, seeing her. "Thank you." 2 words. Simple, quiet. But she heard what lived beneath them. The weight of years, the depth of grief, the first fragile thread of something that might, given enough time and care, become trust. She nodded, turned back to the stove. Outside, the sun dropped below the tree line. Shadows stretched across the clearing like dark fingers reaching for the cabin walls. And somewhere in the distance, from deep within the forest, a wolf began to howl. The sound rose and fell, long and lonely, echoing off the mountains before fading into silence. Martha's hands paused over the bread dough. The wolf howled again, closer this time. And from the stable, the horse began to scream. Silas grabbed the rifle from the wall and was out the door before Martha could speak. She ran after him. The night air hit her face cold and sharp, carrying the smell of pine resin and something else underneath, something rank, animal, wild. The horse screamed again. Hooves pounded against wood. A crack split the darkness, the sound of boards breaking under desperate weight. Silas sprinted across the clearing. Martha followed, her skirts catching on brush, her boots slipping on damp grass. The moon hung low and swollen above the tree line, casting silver light across everything, turning the world to shades of gray and black and shadow. The stable door hung open, splintered at the top hinge where something had forced its way through. Silas stopped at the entrance, rifle raised to his shoulder, barrel aimed into the darkness beyond. Martha came up behind him, breathing hard, and looked past his shoulder into the ruined space. The mare pressed against the far wall, eyes rolling white, foam dripping from her mouth. Blood streaked her flank, long scratches. Shallow, but bleeding freely, running from shoulder to hip in parallel lines. She stamped and snorted, head tossing, too terrified to stand still. The wolf was gone, but the damage remained. The feed bin had been torn open. Oats scattered across the dirt floor in a pale carpet. The saddle rack lay overturned. Leather straps chewed through. And in the corner where Silas had made his bed for the past 9 nights, the blankets were shredded, pulled apart in long strips. The straw beneath scattered and soaked with something that smelled sharp and acrid. The wolf had marked its territory. Silas lowered the rifle. His shoulders dropped. His head fell forward until his chin nearly touched his chest. Martha pushed past him into the stable. She went to the mare first, hands up, palms open, voice low and steady. Easy now. Easy, girl. It's gone. You're safe. The horse snorted, stamped, but didn't bolt. Martha ran her hands along the scratches, feeling the heat of inflammation already rising beneath the broken skin. Surface wounds. They would heal with proper care. She turned to look at Silas. He stood in the doorway, rifle hanging loose at his side, staring at the destroyed bedding in the corner. The blankets his wife had made. The last soft thing he'd allowed himself to keep. Torn to rags, soiled, ruined. Mr. Kane, don't. His voice came out flat, dead, emptied of everything. He walked out into the night. Martha followed him into the clearing. He was heading toward the tree line, toward the darkness where the wolf had disappeared, moving with the stiff gait of a man who had stopped caring what happened next. You can't track it in the dark. I'm not tracking it. He stopped at the edge of the pines, stood there with his back to her, shoulders rigid beneath his worn shirt. the rifle hanging forgotten at his side. Then he threw it. The weapon spun through the air, struck a tree trunk with a hollow crack, clattered to the ground among the roots. The sound echoed off the mountains like a gunshot in the silence. Martha didn't move. Silas's hands came up to his face, pressed against his eyes. His whole body began to shake. Not weeping this time. Something deeper than that. Something that had no sound at all. Just trembling, like a man standing in a cold wind that wouldn't stop blowing. She waited. The night pressed in around them. The moon climbed higher. The cold seeped through her dress, through her skin, into her bones. But she waited. Finally, his hands dropped. He turned around. In the moonlight, his face was stripped of everything. Every wall he'd built. Every mask he'd worn. Nothing left but a man who had lost too much and kept losing, standing in the wreckage of his own small life. I can't do this anymore. Martha's throat tightened. I thought... He stopped, swallowed. Tried again. When you found that receipt today, I thought maybe things could turn around. Maybe I could fight Granger and win and keep this land, and finally... His voice cracked. He looked away, toward the stable, toward the darkness beyond. And then this, the wolf, the blankets, her blankets, Martha. The only thing I had left that she ever touched with her own hands. The last piece of her in this world. He gestured at the stable, at the night, at everything and nothing. Now what's the point? What's the point of fighting for any of it? Martha walked toward him. Pine needles crunched beneath her boots. She stopped 2 feet away, close enough to see the moisture on his cheeks, close enough to smell the sweat and fear and exhaustion coming off him in waves. The point is tomorrow. He laughed. Bitter. Hollow. A sound like something breaking. I mean it. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. Tomorrow, you wake up. You patch that stable door. You tend the mare's wounds. You ride down to town and show that receipt to the sheriff and anyone else who'll look at it. You fight. Why, Chance? The word fell between them like a stone. Why should I fight for anything anymore? Martha thought of Ohio, the bakery that failed after her mother got sick, the creditors who took everything except the clothes on her back, the whispers that followed her down every street, the fat girl, the spinster, the one nobody wanted. She thought of the stagecoach. 3 weeks of dust and jolting roads and sleeping upright because she couldn't afford a room. The driver who wouldn't help her down. The boy who abandoned her on the trail. She thought of this cabin. This man. This impossible, broken place she had somehow started to call home. Because I didn't travel 400 miles to watch you give up. Silas stared at her. The moonlight caught his eyes wet still. But something else there now. Something that hadn't been there a moment ago. You go inside tonight, she said. Sleep in the cabin. I'll take the stable. No, I won't let you. It's not a discussion. Mr. Kane. She was already walking past him, toward the ruined stable. Toward the scattered oats and shredded blankets and the mare still trembling against the far wall. Go inside, get some rest. Tomorrow we fight. She didn't look back to see if he followed her instructions. The stable smelled of horse sweat and wolf musk and fear. Martha found the lantern hanging by the door, struck a match, let the small flame push back the pressing darkness. She gathered what remained of the ruined blankets, set them in a pile outside. Found a horse blanket folded on a shelf, rougher than wool, smelling of the mare, but intact. She spread it in the corner farthest from the broken door, sat down, drew her knees up to her chest. The cold crept through the thin fabric, through her dress, through her skin, into the very center of her. This was where he slept every night for 3 years, while 3 women came and went from the cabin he'd built for a wife who never got to live in it. He lay here in the straw and the cold and the darkness, listening to the wind and the wolves, alone with nothing but his grief for company. And now she was here, in his place, choosing this. The thought struck her hard, like a fist to the chest. She had chosen this? Not because there was nowhere else there were poorhouses in Ohio. Churches that took in women without means, distant relatives who might have offered a room if she'd begged hard enough. She had chosen this man, this mountain, this impossible fight. Why the lantern flame guttered in a draft. Shadows danced across the stable walls. Martha closed her eyes, breathed in the smell of hay and horse and the fading musk of wolf. She didn't know yet, not fully, but she knew she wasn't leaving. The hours passed, the cold deepened. Martha dozed and woke and dozed again, her body curling tighter each time against the chill. The mare settled gradually, her breathing evening out, her head drooping towards sleep. In the darkest part of the night, the stable door creaked. Martha's eyes snapped open. Her hand found the pitchfork she'd laid beside her, fingers closing around the rough wood handle. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, broad, blocking the moonlight. "It's me, Silas." He stepped inside, carrying something in his arms. The quilt from the cabin, the one she'd been sleeping under since she arrived. He crossed to where she sat, knelt down, and draped it over her shoulders without saying a word. The warmth hit her like a wave. She hadn't realized how deeply cold she'd become until that moment, until the shaking in her hands began to ease, and feeling crept back into her numbed fingers. He didn't leave. He lowered himself to the ground beside her, his back against the stable wall, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body through the quilt. Neither of them spoke. The night stretched on. The mare breathed. The wind whispered through the gaps in the walls. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, Martha felt herself lean toward him. Just slightly. Her shoulder brushing against his arm, he didn't move away. Move. Dawn came gray and cold. Martha woke to find herself alone. The quilt still wrapped around her shoulders, the stable door repaired with fresh boards nailed across the broken section. She rose stiffly. Every joint ached. Every muscle protested. But she pushed open the door and stepped out into the pale morning light. Silas stood in the clearing, saddling the mare. His rifle hung across his back in its leather scabbard. In his hand he held the receipt, Sarah's receipt, folded carefully, tucked into a piece of oilcloth to protect it from weather and wear. He looked up as she approached. "I'm riding down to town." His voice was different this morning, steadier, calmer, like something had settled in him during the night. "Going to see the sheriff? Show him the proof?" Martha nodded. "I'll have supper ready when you get back." He swung up into the saddle. The mare danced beneath him, still nervous from the night before. but he held her steady, with hands that knew the language of horses. "Martha?" She looked up at him, squinting against the rising sun. He opened his mouth, closed it. Something moved behind his eyes, words he couldn't find. Feelings he didn't know how to name. Finally, keep the fire going. He turned the mare toward the trail and rode into the trees. Martha watched until he disappeared around the bend. Then she walked back to the cabin, built up the fire in the stove, and set the coffee to boil. The sun climbed higher. The morning warmed toward noon. She swept the floor, kneaded the bread dough, checked the chickens in their coop behind the cabin, and waited. Noon came and went. No sign of him. Afternoon faded toward evening. The bread cooled on the table, untouched. The coffee went cold in its pot. Martha stood at the window, watching the tree line, watching the trail, watching for any sign of movement. The shadows lengthened. The sun touched the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Still nothing. Then movement in the trees. Martha's heart lifted. She moved toward the door, ready to greet him, ready to hear what the sheriff had said. But it wasn't Silas who rode into the clearing. It was Murphy, alone. His mule lathered with sweat, sides heaving. His face was the color of ash, his hands gripping the reins so tight his knuckles showed white against the leather. He stopped at the porch steps, looked down at her. "There's trouble." His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. "Granger's men caught him on the road halfway to town. Took him. They got him locked up now, down in Cedar Hollow. Sheriff says he's being held for theft and fraud." Martha's legs went weak. She grabbed the porch rail to keep from falling. "And the receipt?" Murphy's jaw tightened. His eyes dropped to the ground, unable to meet hers. "Gone. They took it from him. Burned it right there in the street while he watched." Martha was on Murphy's mule before the old man finished speaking. "Wait now!" He grabbed for the bridle, missed, stumbled forward. "You can't just ride into town like this. Granger's got men watching every road. They see you coming. They'll let go." Her voice didn't sound like her own. Cold, flat. The voice of a woman who had stopped calculating risks and consequences. Murphy's hand fell away from the harness. She kicked her heels into the mule's flanks. The animal lurched forward, breaking into a reluctant trot. Then something closer to a canter as she dug in harder. Behind her, Murphy shouted something, a warning, maybe, or a prayer. She didn't hear it. The wind filled her ears, tore at her hair, whipped her skirts against the mule's sweating sides. The trail down the mountain blurred past. Pine trees, rock outcroppings. The creek where she'd found Silas on his knees just days ago. All of it meaningless now. All of it just distance between her and the town where they held him. The ride took an hour, maybe less. The sun had dropped below the ridge when Cedar Hollow came into view, 3 buildings she recognized. And now a crowd gathered in the street where no crowd had been before. Martha pulled the mule to a halt at the edge of town. 40 people, maybe more. Farmers in mud-stained overalls. Women in faded bonnets clutching children's hands. Old men leaning on fence rails with expressions she couldn't read. All of them facing the same direction toward a wooden platform that hadn't existed when she'd arrived 3 weeks ago. A gallows. The frame stood skeletal against the darkening sky. Crossbeam in place. Rope not yet hung, but coiled at the base like a sleeping snake. Men with hammers crouched at the foundation, driving nails into fresh lumber. And beside it, in the shadow of the general store, stood the jail. A squat building of rough-cut stone with iron bars set into narrow windows. Two men with rifles leaned against the doorframe, cigarettes glowing orange in the gathering dusk. Martha dismounted, her legs shook beneath her weight. Her hands trembled as she tied the mule's reins to the nearest hitching post. She walked toward the jail. The crowd noticed her. Heads turned, whispers spread outward like ripples in still water. She caught fragments as she passed the fat bride. Still here, come to beg for him. But she kept her eyes forward, kept walking. One of the guards straightened as she approached. Young, barely 20, peach fuzz on his upper lip where a mustache was trying to grow. His rifle came up, not quite pointing at her, but ready. "Ma'am, you can't. I need to see the sheriff. He's occupied at present. Then he can get unoccupied." The guard's eyes widened. He glanced at his partner, older, grayer, a thick scar running from his left eyebrow down to his jaw. The scarred man shrugged. "Let her through. Sheriff can sort her out." Martha pushed between them. The door scraped against warped floorboards as she shoved it open. Inside a desk covered in papers. A potbelly stove gone cold. A single lantern throwing weak light across bare walls. And beyond, behind iron bars thick as her wrist, a shape slumped in the corner of a cell. Silas. His face was a ruin. Left eye swollen shut. The skin around it purple and black. Blood crusted at the corner of his mouth, dried brown against his beard. His hands hung between his knees, wrists raw and red where rope had bound them. He looked up when the door opened. His good eye found her through the dim light. Something flickered there, surprise. Then shame. Then a terrible blankness as he turned his face away. "You shouldn't have come." Martha crossed to the bars, wrapped her fingers around the cold iron, pressed her face close to the gap between them. "What did they do to you? Doesn't matter now. It matters to me." A sound behind her, footsteps on wooden boards, the smell of tobacco smoke and bay rum cologne. Well, the mail-order bride herself." She turned. The man was young 30, maybe, with a clean-shaved jaw and clothes too fine for this dusty town. A gold watch chain glinted against his vest. His smile showed teeth too white, too even, too practiced. "You must be Granger," Martha said. "William Granger II. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "My father owned this land before your husband stole it from him. Now I'm simply taking back what's rightfully mine. He didn't steal anything. There was a receipt, legal and witnessed. Was..." Granger's smile widened. Such an unfortunate thing about paper. Burns so easily. Goes up in smoke and ash, and then it's like it never existed at all. Martha's fingernails bit into her palms. She felt skin break, felt warmth where blood was rising. But the pain seemed very far away. "The sheriff works for me. Most of this town works for me, one way or another." Granger stepped closer. She could smell the whiskey on his breath now, see the broken veins spreading across his nose like red rivers on a map. "Here's how this goes. Tomorrow morning, your husband hangs for theft and fraud. This land reverts to its rightful owner, that being me. And you His eyes moved down her body. Slow, deliberate, taking inventory. You can stay on if you like. I could find some use for a woman with your particular qualities. Behind her, chains rattled against stone. Silas lunged against the bars, reaching through with hands still raw from the ropes. Don't you touch her. Don't you even look at her. You... Granger laughed. A light, easy sound like a man amused by a dog straining at its leash. Still got some fight left. Good. Makes the hanging more entertaining for the crowd. He turned and walked out. The door banged shut behind him. The sound echoed through the small room and faded into silence. Martha stood frozen. The guards stayed outside. The jail grew quiet except for the sound of Silas's ragged breathing behind her. Martha. His voice came from the cell, raw and broken. Go back to the cabin. Take Murphy's mule. Ride north until you hit the railroad. Then keep going. Back to Ohio. Anywhere. Just forget this place ever existed. She didn't move. Martha, please, I'm begging you. She turned, walked to the bars, reached through the gap, and took his hand, the hand that had pulled the axe from the woodpile, that had built her a chair, that had draped a quilt over her shoulders in the cold, stable night. I'm not leaving. There's nothing you can do. The receipt is gone. Burned. The sheriff won't help. The whole town is bought and paid for. Maybe. She squeezed his fingers, felt the bones beneath the broken skin. But I'm still not leaving. The lantern on the sheriff's desk guttered as its oil ran low. Shadows stretched across the walls like grasping hands. Martha sat down on the floor beside the cell, her back against the cold bars, her hand still holding his through the narrow gap. The night deepened around them. The town grew quiet outside, no more hammering, no more voices. Just the wind moving through empty streets and the distant howl of a wolf somewhere in the mountains. Her mind raced through possibilities. Plans formed and crumbled like sandcastles against a rising tide. She had no money, no allies, no weapons. She was a woman alone in a town that belonged to the man who wanted her husband dead. Think. There had to be something. The receipt was ash, burned to nothing, but receipts were copies of transactions. The original record of any legal land sale would be kept somewhere official, somewhere Granger couldn't reach. Her breath caught in her chest. Silas? He stirred behind her. He'd been drifting. Exhaustion and pain pulling him down toward unconsciousness. The sale. When your wife's father sold you the land, where was it recorded? County courthouse. His voice came out slurred, thick with fatigue. Down in Denver. There would be a record, a ledger entry, something with both signatures that proves the transaction happened. Silas's hand tightened around hers. His eye focused on her face with sudden sharpness. The county recorder's office. They keep copies of every deed, every bill of sale. It's the law. And Granger burned the receipt. But he can't burn a government record sitting in a courthouse 100 miles away. No. Strength crept back into his voice. No, he can't. Martha pushed herself up from the floor. Her body ached from the ride, from the fear, from everything, but her mind was clear now, sharp as a blade. How far is Denver? 3 days by fast horse. But Martha, there isn't time. The hanging is set for tomorrow morning. even if you rode through the night without stopping? I'm not going to Denver. He stared at her through the bars. The telegraph office? I saw it when I first arrived, wires running up to the roof of the building next to the general store. She spoke quickly now, the plan taking shape as the words left her mouth. If I can send a message to the county recorder, get them to wire back confirmation of the sale. Granger controls the telegraph operator. Martha's jaw tightened. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Then I'll have to convince him otherwise. She moved toward the door. Silas's hand shot through the bars and caught her wrist. They'll stop you. They'll hurt you. Martha, I can't. His voice cracked like dry wood splitting. I already lost, Sarah. I can't watch you die because of me. She turned back, leaned close to the bars. Close enough that she could see the fear in his one good eye, the desperation, the love he hadn't yet found words for. You're not going to lose me, she said quietly. I'm not that easy to get rid of. You should know that by now. She pulled her wrist free, crossed to the door, pushed it open. The guards had moved to the far end of the porch, sharing a cigarette, their backs to the jail entrance. Beyond them, the street lay empty under a thin sliver of moon. The gallows stood dark and waiting. And 50 yards away, past the general store, a single light burned in an upstairs window. The telegraph office. Martha stepped out into the night, walked past the guards before they noticed her moving, crossed the empty street, her boots silent on the packed dirt. The office was dark at street level. But that light upstairs, the operator's quarters, he'd be there, sleeping, maybe, or sitting awake with his guilt for company. She found the stairs around back, climbed them quietly, knocked on the door. Footsteps inside. The scrape of a chair. The door cracked open, revealing a thin face with spectacles perched on a long nose. Suspicious eyes looked her up and down. Office is closed. I need to send a message. Come back tomorrow. He started to push the door shut. Martha's hand shot out, held it open. A man is going to die tomorrow morning. He's going to hang because William Granger burned the only proof of a legal land sale. She spoke fast, her words tumbling over each other. The county recorder in Denver has a copy of that proof. All you have to do is send one message. One, ask them to confirm the transaction. And an innocent man lives instead of dies. The operator's face twisted. She saw fear there, real, deep, bone-shaking fear, but something else underneath it, something that looked almost like shame. Granger will kill me if I cross him. Maybe, Martha held his gaze, but if you don't send that message, you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you let an innocent man hang when you could have saved him. You'll eat with that knowledge. Sleep with it. Wake up every morning and see his face when you look in the mirror. The operator's hand trembled on the doorframe. Martha waited. The seconds stretched out like hours. Somewhere in the town behind her, a dog barked once and fell silent. The wind stirred dust in the empty street below. Then the door swung wider. Come in. The operator stepped back, his face pale in the lamplight. Quickly, before someone sees. Martha slipped inside. The room was small, a narrow bed, a wash basin, a desk cluttered with papers. And in the corner, the telegraph machine. Brass and black enamel, gleaming in the dim light. The operator sat down at his desk. His fingers hovered over the key, trembling like leaves in a storm. "What do you want me to say?" Martha leaned forward. Her voice came out steady, each word precise and clear. "To the county recorder, Denver, Colorado. Urgent request for immediate confirmation of land deed transfer from Granger to Kane. Dated November 1868, parcel 47, Cedar Hollow District. Man facing wrongful execution. Response required before dawn." She paused, drew a breath. "Sign it, Martha Kane." The operator's fingers began to move. The telegraph key clicked and clattered, sending her words out into the darkness, across miles of wire stretched over mountains and plains, racing toward the only hope she had left. When the message finished transmitting, the operator looked up at her. Response could take hours, maybe longer, depending on who's working the night shift in Denver. "Then I'll wait." She lowered herself into the corner, drew her knees up to her chest, fixed her eyes on the window, watching the sky for any sign of light. Below, in the street, the gallows stood ready. And somewhere in Denver, a telegraph machine waited to deliver an answer that would save a man's life or seal his fate forever. The sun rose red over Cedar Hollow. Martha stood at the window of the telegraph office, watching the street below fill with people. Farmers who had ridden in from outlying homesteads, shopkeepers closing their doors to join the gathering, women clutching shawls against the morning chill, children pressed close to their skirts, all of them moving toward the gallows like water finding its lowest point. Behind her, the telegraph machine sat silent. It had been silent for hours. The operator paced the narrow room, bit at the skin around his thumbnail until it bled, glanced at the door every few seconds as if expecting Granger's men to kick it in. "They're bringing him out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Martha moved to the other window, the one facing the jail. The door swung open. Two guards emerged first, rifles held across their chests. Behind them came Silas. His hands were bound in front of him with fresh rope. His face that ruined. Beautiful face was a mask of bruises and dried blood. But he walked straight, walked steady, his eyes fixed on some point ahead that only he could see. The crowd parted to let them through. Silent now, no jeering, no shouting, no cries for blood, just the creak of boots on wooden planks and the distant call of a hawk circling high above the valley. William Granger stood at the base of the gallows, his gold watch chain catching the early light. The sheriff beside him kept his hat pulled low, his eyes on the ground, refusing to look at the man being led to his death. Martha's fingers dug into the windowsill. Splinters drove under her nails. She didn't feel them. Click. She spun around. The telegraph machine rattled to life. The brass arm jumped and danced against the receiver, tapping out a pattern of dots and dashes that filled the small room like gunfire. The operator lunged for his desk, his pencil scratched across paper, transcribing each signal with shaking hands. His face changed as he wrote first concentration, then disbelief, then something that might have been hope breaking through the fear. "What does it say?" He held up the paper. His whole arm trembled. "County recorder confirms deed transfer. Ezekiel Granger to Silas Kane. November 14th, 1868, parcel 47, Cedar Hollow District. Original document on file, signed and witnessed and notarized according to territorial law." The operator looked up at her, his spectacles crooked on his pale face. "Sale legal and binding. No basis for fraud charges." Martha snatched the paper from his hand. She was down the stairs before she knew she was moving. Her boots pounded against wood, then packed dirt as she burst onto the street, The crowd turned as 150 faces, 60, all staring at the woman running toward the gallows with a piece of paper clutched in her fist. Silas was climbing the steps. 3, 4, 5. The platform groaned beneath his weight. The noose hung waiting, rope freshly oiled, knot tied with professional care. Martha ran, her lungs burned, her legs screamed. The telegram crumpled in her sweating palm, the ink already starting to smear. Granger saw her coming, his face twisted. He stepped forward, arms raised to block her path. His fine suit jacket spreading wide like the wings of some dark bird. She didn't slow down. She hit him with her shoulder, all her weight behind it. Not enough to knock him flat, but enough to send him stumbling sideways, enough to clear a path to the gallows steps. The sheriff moved to intercept her. His hand went to the pistol at his hip. Martha thrust the telegram into his face. "Read it." He froze. His eyes moved across the words once, twice, 3 times. The color drained from his cheeks like water from a cracked basin. Behind her, Granger was scrambling to his feet, dust on his fine suit, rage burning in his eyes. "What are you waiting for? Finish it. Hang him." The sheriff didn't move. "This is an official communication from the county recorder's office in Denver." Martha raised her voice, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "It confirms that the land sale was legal. There was no theft, no fraud. Silas Kane owns that property free and clear, same as he has for the past 10 years. Murmurs spread through the crowd like wind through wheat. People craned their necks, trying to see the paper in her hand. Granger shoved his way toward her. "That's a forgery. She wrote it herself. The telegraph operator is in on the scheme. Arrest them both. Then send another message." Martha's voice cut through his. "Right now, in front of everyone. Ask Denver to confirm again." Silence fell over the street. Granger's mouth opened, closed. His eyes darted to the sheriff, to the crowd, to the gallows where Silas stood with the noose not yet around his neck. That's not the telegraph office is closed. It's open." Murphy's voice came from somewhere in the gathered people. The old man pushed forward through the press of bodies, his weathered face hard as the mountain stone. "I'll walk over there myself and watch the operator send it, unless you've got some reason you don't want him to." More voices joined in. The crowd shifted, turned toward Granger. Faces that had been neutral, now questioning, accusing. The sheriff folded the telegram carefully, tucked it into his breast pocket. "Cut him loose." Granger lunged forward, grabbing the sheriff's arm. "You work for me. You can't just—" "I said cut him loose." The sheriff's hand came to rest on his pistol grip. "Unless you want to explain to a federal judge why you forged evidence and tried to hang an innocent man for your daddy's gambling debts." The guards on the platform exchanged glances. One of them reached for the knife at his belt. The blade flashed in the morning sun. The ropes fell away from Silas's wrists and dropped to the wooden boards. Martha's knees buckled. Strong hands caught her Murphy, appearing at her side, steadying her before she fell. "Easy now, girl. Easy." She couldn't speak, could barely breathe. All she could do was watch as Silas walked down the gallows steps, one at a time, each step bringing him closer to her. He stopped 3 feet away. His face was a ruin. Swollen eye, split lip, bruises layered over bruises in shades of purple and black and yellow. But his good eye was clear, focused, fixed on her like she was the only thing in the world worth seeing. "You came back for me. I never left." His hand reached out, trembling, touched her face. His palm was rough with rope burns, warm against her cheek. The crowd watched. The sheriff watched. Even Granger watched, his face a mask of impotent fury as two of Murphy's neighbors took him by the arms and led him away. But Martha didn't see any of them. She saw only Silas. This man who had built walls so high he'd almost disappeared behind them. This man who had stopped believing anyone would stay. "Let's go home," she said. They walked through the crowd together, side by side, not touching now that would come later, in private, where no eyes could follow, but close. Close enough that their shoulders brushed with every step. Murphy brought the mule forward. The mare waited beside it. Brought down from the mountain by one of the neighbors, Martha didn't know which one, didn't care. Silas took the reins, swung up into the saddle with a wince that spoke of cracked ribs and bruised muscles. He reached down, offered his hand. She took it, let him pull her up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and held on tight. The ride home took most of the day. The trail wound up the mountain through stands of pine and across meadows bright with wildflowers. Neither of them spoke. Words seemed too small for what had happened, too fragile for what lay ahead. The cabin waited in the clearing, smoke still rising from the chimney where the fire Martha had built yesterday had somehow kept burning. She slid down from the mare's back, her legs stiff, her whole body aching with exhaustion, but there was work to do. She went inside, built up the fire, put water on to heat. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, kneading bread, brewing coffee, setting the table for two. Silas appeared in the doorway. He'd washed his face at the creek, scrubbing away the dried blood, but the bruises remained, purple and black and yellow. A map of violence written across his skin. He crossed to the table, sat down in his chair, looked at the second chair, the one he'd built for her, and something shifted in his expression. "I thought I was going to die this morning." Martha poured coffee into 2 cups, set one in front of him, sat down across from him in her chair. "You didn't?" "Because of you." She lifted her cup, blew across the steaming surface, because of us. Because of... Silence settled between them, comfortable now. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, a bird sang some mountain species she didn't recognize, its call sweet and clear in the afternoon air. Silas reached across the table. His hand covered hers. Rough fingers. Gentle pressure. "Martha?" "Yes." "Stay." One word, simple as breathing, heavy as the mountain itself. She turned her hand over, laced her fingers through his. "I already am." The days that followed moved slowly. Silas's bruises faded from purple to green to yellow, then disappeared altogether. His cracked ribs healed. The swelling around his eye went down until he could see clearly again. They fell into a rhythm. She cooked, he chopped wood. She swept, he mended the stable door properly, replacing the boards the wolf had broken. They ate together at the table with its 2 chairs. They talked not much, not often, but more than before. Small things at first. The weather, the chickens, the bread that came out better each time she baked it. Then larger things. His wife, Sarah. The child who never drew breath. The 3 years of grief that had turned him into a ghost haunting his own home. And her things too. The bakery in Ohio. Her mother's slow death. The weight of being unwanted, unloved, unseen. 2 weeks after the hanging that never happened, Murphy rode up the mountain with news. Granger had been arrested. The federal marshal had taken him to Denver to face charges of fraud and attempted murder. he wouldn't be coming back. That night, Silas disappeared into the stable after supper. Martha heard him moving around in there, boards creaking, tools clanking, the sound of a saw working through wood. She didn't ask what he was doing. The next morning, she found out. He led her around the back of the cabin, past the woodpile and the chicken coop, to the place where the ground rose slightly before falling away toward the creek. The grave was there, the wooden cross she'd noticed her first week, weathered gray by years of mountain weather. But something new stood beside it. A bench. Simple pine. The wood still fresh and pale, smelling of sap and sawdust. Big enough for two. Silas stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at the grave. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. "Sarah, she would have liked how stubborn you are." Martha lowered herself onto the bench. The wood was smooth beneath her palms, sanded carefully, every splinter removed. "Tell me about her." So he did. He sat down beside her, their shoulders touching, and talked until the sun climbed high and started its long descent toward the western ridge. He told her about Sarah's laugh, her cooking, the way she sang while she worked, the hidden compartments she built into furniture, the little surprises she left for him to find. When he finished, they sat in silence for a while. The wind moved through the pines. A hawk circled overhead. Down in the meadow, wildflowers nodded in the breeze. "I want to plant something here," Martha said finally. "A tree, maybe. Something that blooms in the spring?" Silas nodded slowly. His hand found hers on the bench between them. She would have liked that too. Another week passed. The days grew warmer. Martha's garden, a small plot she'd cleared behind the cabin, began to show green shoots pushing through the dark soil. Carrots, beans, the beginnings of something that would feed them through the coming months. On a morning like any other, Silas came in from the stable, carrying something in his closed fist. He stood in the doorway, the light behind him, his face unreadable. "I found something." Martha looked up from the bread dough she was kneading. "What is it?" He crossed to the table, opened his hand. A ring lay in his palm, simple gold band, worn thin from years of wear, catching the light from the window. "It was my mother's. I gave it to Sarah when we married." His voice was steady, but his hand trembled slightly. "She didn't want to wear it at first. Said it might be bad luck, wearing a dead woman's ring. But she came around eventually. Wore it every day until..." He stopped. Swallowed hard. "I put it away after. Couldn't stand to look at it. Forgot where I'd hidden it until this morning, when I was moving things in the stable." Martha wiped the flour from her hands. Waited. "I don't believe in luck anymore," Silas said. "Good or bad. I believe in choices. In people who show up and people who don't. In staying when leaving would be easier." He knelt down in front of her. His bad knee hit the floor hard. She heard the joint pop, saw him wince, but he didn't get up. "Martha Brennan, I'm not good with words. Never have been. But I know this much." He held up the ring, the gold glinting between his rough fingers. "You saved my life, not just on that gallows. Every day since you got here, you've been saving me. And I want..." His voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. "I want to spend whatever time I've got left trying to deserve you. Will you marry me?" Martha looked at the ring, at his hands, still marked with scars from the rope that had bound them. At his face healed now, the bruises gone, but the lines of grief still there, probably always would be. She reached out, took the ring from his palm, slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. Yes. He stood up, pulled her to her feet, wrapped his arms around her careful still, because his ribs hadn't fully healed, and held her close. They stood like that for a long time. The bread dough sat forgotten on the table. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the mountain rose green and patient against the endless blue of the sky. A month later, the circuit preacher came through Cedar Hollow. Murphy rode up the mountain to tell them. And 2 days later, they stood before the old man in the clearing behind the cabin, right there beside Sarah's grave. Beneath the young apple tree Martha had planted the week before. The ceremony was simple. No flowers except the wildflowers growing in the meadow. No music except bird song. No guests except Murphy and 2 neighbor women who'd made the climb up the mountain with baskets of food for the celebration after. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, the only sound was the wind in the pines. When he pronounced them married, Silas kissed her gentle, almost shy, like a man who'd forgotten how such things were done. That night, after the neighbors had gone and Murphy had ridden back down to town, Martha stood on the cabin porch watching the stars come out, one by one. They appeared scattered across the darkness like spilled salt, more than she'd ever seen in Ohio, more than she'd known the sky could hold. Silas came out to stand beside her. He draped a blanket over her shoulders, the quilt she'd been sleeping under since her first night here, worn soft now from use. "Regrets?" he asked. She leaned into him, felt his arm come around her, solid and warm. Not one. They stayed there until the cold drove them inside, until the fire burned low and the lamp guttered out, until they lay together in the bed that had been his alone for so long, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting over hers. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee. Not her coffee, his, weak and slightly burned, the way he always made it when he tried. She found him at the stove, moving carefully around his still healing ribs, 2 cups already poured. "You made coffee. Figured it was time I learned to do it properly." He handed her a cup, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "How is it?" She sipped. It was terrible. Watered down and bitter. Somehow both too weak and too strong at the same time. "Perfect," she said, and meant it. Outside, the sun rose over the mountain. The apple tree by the grave lifted its young branches toward the light. In the stable, the mare nickered softly, waiting for her morning feed. And in the cabin, 2 people who had found each other at the end of the road sat down to breakfast together. Not because they had to, because they chose to, every single day